My name is Carla Voss. I'm 37, and I found out exactly what I was worth to my family the morning my brother handed me a notice to vacate the bedroom I had paid for. The house was in my name, my credit, my signature on the mortgage. My brother Owen had been living in it for 2 years, paying me back, he said, in installments. He'd missed the last 4. When I knocked on his door to talk about it, his girlfriend answered. She told me Owen wasn't available. Then she handed me a folded piece of paper, a legal notice. My name printed at the top as tenant, his name signed at the bottom as owner. I stood in the hallway of my own house, holding a document that had rearranged the whole world without my permission. I didn't cry. I didn't raise my voice. I went back to my room, sat on the edge of the bed, and opened my laptop. And what I found in the next 2 hours cost my brother everything he thought he'd built. Welcome back to silent drama stories, where the quietest people in the room turn out to be the ones holding all the cards. If someone in your life has ever mistaken your patience for ignorance, this one is for you. Drop a comment and tell me the moment you realized you'd been underestimated. And subscribe, because the ending of this one is something I still can't fully believe happened. Let me take you back to the beginning, because nothing that happened makes sense without it. I grew up in a small city in central Ohio, the kind of place where everyone knows your parents' business, and your high school reputation follows you to the grocery store at 35. There were 3 of us. Me, Owen, who is 2 years younger, and our sister Deb, who is 5 years younger and lives in Phoenix and has the good sense to be far away from most of this. Our parents were not bad people. I want to say that clearly. Our mother, Patris, worked dispatch for the county sheriff's office for 22 years. Our father, Glenn, drove a delivery route and coached youth baseball on weekends and was the kind of man who remembered every kid's birthday on his team but sometimes forgot his own children's. They did what they could. They stretched what they had. And when the money got tight, which it did more than once, they leaned on the person who had always seemed most capable of handling it. That person was me. I don't know exactly when I became the family's load-bearing wall. It happened the way most things happen in a family, gradually, and then all at once. And by the time you notice, the weight has been there so long you've stopped feeling it as weight. You've just started calling it your spine. I was the one who helped Glenn fill out his disability paperwork when his back gave out in my mid-20s. I was the one who found the lawyer when Patris got into that fender bender the other driver tried to turn into a lawsuit. I was the one who drove Owen to his AA meetings for 8 months without ever telling a single person I was doing it, because Owen had asked me not to, and I kept his secrets the way I kept everything else. Quietly, without complaint, without acknowledgement. I work in insurance underwriting. I have for 12 years. I assess risk for a living. I read the fine print. I know what words like indemnity and subrogation and quiet title mean, and I know them not from a textbook but from 12 years of sitting with the consequences of what happens when people don't. I mention this because it matters later. It matters a lot. By my early 30s, I had saved enough for a down payment on a house. Not a big house. A 3-bedroom ranch in a neighborhood that was coming back up. One of those streets where half the houses are renovated and the other half are still waiting. But it was mine. My credit score, my down payment, my plan. And then Owen called. Owen is the kind of person who has a gift for making his crises feel like your responsibility. I don't say that with contempt. I say it because it's true, and because understanding it is the only way any of what came next makes sense. He called in March, 2.5 years before the morning with the notice. He'd been sober 14 months. He had a new girlfriend, Trish, and she had a 6-year-old daughter, and they were renting a 2-bedroom apartment that was, according to Owen, falling apart. He wanted to get somewhere stable, somewhere his girlfriend's daughter could have a real yard. He'd been looking at houses, he said. There was one in particular, 3 bedrooms, good bones, reasonable neighborhood, south side of the city near the schools Trish wanted. The problem was his credit. 2 years clean, but the years before that had left marks. Missed payments, a repossession, a credit card charge-off. His number wasn't unsalvageable, but it wasn't mortgage-ready either, and the house was priced at $218,000, and without a solid borrower attached, the bank wasn't going to move. He asked me to co-sign, and I said no. I want to be honest about that part because some people in stories like this say they never saw it coming. I saw it coming. I'd worked in insurance for 10 years at that point. I knew what a co-signature meant. I knew what happened to co-signers when the primary borrower defaulted. I had seen it happen to other people's families in the paperwork that crossed my desk. I told him no, and he accepted it, and I thought that was the end of it. It wasn't the end of it. It was the beginning of a different ask. He called back 3 days later with a new idea. What if, instead of co-signing his mortgage, I bought the house myself? My name on the deed, my mortgage, my credit. He would pay me the full mortgage payment every month plus $200. Essentially, he'd be renting from me at slightly above market rate, building his credit in the meantime, and in 5 years he'd refinance it into his own name and buy me out. I told him I needed to think about it. I thought about it for 2 weeks. I ran the numbers, which I am good at. I consulted a real estate attorney, which cost me $300 that I considered money well spent. The attorney told me the structure Owen was describing was not uncommon. It was called a lease-to-own arrangement, and if properly documented, if there was a formal lease, a documented payment history, a written purchase agreement with a timeline, it could work. If properly documented. I came back to Owen with conditions. I would do this, but we were doing it the right way. There would be a lease agreement, a real one, drawn up by the attorney. There would be a purchase agreement stating the price at which he could buy the house from me in year 5 and the terms under which that sale would occur. There would be a payment schedule, in writing, with consequences for missed payments spelled out clearly. Owen agreed to all of it. I drove to the attorney's office. I paid for the documents. I sat across the table from Owen and Trish while all 3 of us signed them. Owen's hand was steady. He looked me in the eye. He said, "Carla, I swear to you I will not let you down." I believed him. That is the part of the story I have had to sit with the longest. Not that he lied to me, but that I believed him. And the reason I believed him is the same reason I had driven him to AA meetings for 8 months without telling a soul. Because I loved my brother. Because I wanted the sober version of him to be the permanent version. Because I had spent most of my life doing the hard thing quietly and hoping it would eventually matter, and this time I was hoping very badly that it would. I bought the house. The first year was fine. Owen made every payment. He texted me on the 1st of every month, usually just the amount and a thumbs-up emoji, and the money appeared in my account like clockwork. He fixed the back fence himself with lumber he bought at the hardware store. He planted something in the yard, tomatoes, I think, which he was absurdly proud of. Trish painted the front door a color she described as sage and I would describe as aggressively green, but it looked good. The house looked lived, in the way houses are supposed to look lived in. My relationship with Owen during that year was the best it had been since before his drinking got bad. We had Sunday phone calls. He came to my apartment for Thanksgiving and brought the tomatoes he'd grown, which were, to my genuine surprise, excellent. Deb flew in from Phoenix, and the 3 of us sat around my table, and it felt like something I hadn't felt with my family since we were children. It felt like normal. I know now that I was measuring the wrong things. The second year, the payments started slipping. Not disappearing, just slipping. The first of the month would come and go, and the text wouldn't arrive, and I'd send a quick message, "Hey, just checking," and Owen would respond within a few hours. "Sorry, got behind, sending it now." And the money would come, 3 or 4 days late, and I'd cover the mortgage gap out of my own account and recoup it when his payment landed. And I told myself this was a rough patch, not a pattern. By the 8th month of year 2, the payments were consistently late. By the 10th month, they were coming in partial. He'd send half and promise the rest by the 15th, and sometimes the rest would come, and sometimes it would come with another apology and another promise attached to it. I called him in month 11 and said we needed to talk. He said he knew, he was sorry, things had been hard. Trish had reduced her hours because of something with her daughter. He was picking up extra shifts. He needed another month or 2 to stabilize, and then he'd be back on track and he would make up every missed dollar he promised. I gave him another month, then another. By month 14 of year 2, he owed me 4 months of partial payments. The total gap was just under $8,000. I was covering his mortgage out of my own savings account. My emergency fund, the one I had spent years building, the one I kept for exactly the category of thing that having a roof over your head falls into, was shrinking month by month to keep his. I made an appointment with the attorney. I pulled out the lease agreement and read every word of it for the first time since the day we'd signed it. And I found the part I hadn't thought about enough when we drew it up. I had the right to reclaim possession of the property if Owen missed 3 consecutive full payments or accumulated 60 days of unpaid balance. Owen had accumulated well past 60 days. He was in breach of the lease. Legally, I could begin the process of reclaiming the house. I sat with that for a long time, because reclaiming the house meant Owen and Trish and her daughter would have to leave. And Owen had been sober for over 3 years now. And the house had become their home in every way a place becomes a home. The daughter had a room painted the color she'd picked herself. There were tomato plants in the back. I called Owen and told him I needed to see him in person. I drove to the house on a Saturday afternoon. Owen met me at the door. He looked tired. Not the tired I remembered from the drinking years, the hollow kind that lives behind the eyes. This was ordinary tired, work tired. But there was something else in his face when he opened the door and saw me, something careful and sideways, the way a person looks when they know a conversation is coming and they've been trying to figure out which version of it they can survive. We sat at the kitchen table. Trish took her daughter to the park, which I suspected had been arranged in advance. I laid it out plainly. The balance owed, the breach of the lease terms, what the document said I was entitled to do. I told him I wasn't there to do any of it. I was there because I needed a real plan, not another promise, a plan with numbers and dates attached, and I needed to know where we actually stood. Owen was quiet for a long moment. Then he said something I hadn't expected. He said he'd been talking to a lawyer. I asked him what kind of lawyer. He said a real estate lawyer. He said he'd been looking into his options. I asked him what options. He looked at the table. He said that in Ohio, when someone lives in a property and improves it and has documented payments, there are sometimes arguments about equitable interest. He said his lawyer thought he might have a claim. I want to tell you exactly what happened in my body when he said that. Nothing dramatic. No rush of heat. No trembling hands. It was more like something going very still and very clear, the way water goes perfectly flat right before it freezes. I told Owen I understood. I told him I needed to go. And I drove back to my apartment, and I didn't say a word to anyone for the rest of the weekend. On Monday morning, I called my attorney. She listened without interrupting. When I was done, she said, "How much did he improve the property?" I told her about the fence, the door, the garden. She said, "Did he get permits for any of the structural work?" I said the fence hadn't required one, and she said good. She said the equitable interest theory he was describing required a much higher bar than what I'd described. It required substantial uncompensated improvement, typically without a formal lease in place, because a formal lease actually undermined the argument since it established the nature of the relationship clearly. She said, "Did he make you any cash payments at all?" I told her about the 14 months of full payments, and then the partial ones. She said, "So there's documented payment from him to you under a lease agreement, and you have a signed purchase agreement establishing the terms of eventual purchase." "Yes." She said, "He doesn't have an equitable interest claim. He has a breach of lease situation. The claim goes the other direction." Then she paused and said, "Has he changed the locks or done anything to restrict your access to the property?" I said I didn't know. I hadn't tried to enter since the conversation. She said I should try, and she said I should document whatever I found. I drove to the house the next morning. My key worked. I noted that in a text to myself with a timestamp. I walked through the property. Everything was as I'd last seen it. I took photos of each room with the timestamps visible in the metadata. I photographed the improvements, the fence, the door, and I noted their condition. Then I went to my room. The spare bedroom, the one I'd kept in my name on the lease as the owner's reserved space, a clause my attorney had specifically recommended we include, and I sat down on the bed and looked around and thought about what came next. 3 days later, Owen texted me. He said he was sorry about the conversation. He said he'd been scared and had said more than he should. He said his lawyer had told him the claim would be hard to pursue given the paperwork. I replied that I appreciated him letting me know. I asked when we could meet to discuss a realistic payment plan for the arrears. He said he'd call me that weekend. He didn't call. The following Monday, I went to the house and found the notice on my pillow. I want to stop here for a second and make sure you understand what I was looking at. A legal notice, formal language, my name at the top under the word tenant, Owen's name at the bottom under the word owner. The notice stated that as the owner of the property, he was exercising his right to reclaim the bedroom I had been occupying. I had 30 days to vacate. My name is on the mortgage. My name is on the deed. I know this because I put it there, and because I have a copy of every document ever generated in connection with that house, sitting in a fireproof filing cabinet in my apartment. What Owen had done was take a form letter available for free online, substitute names, and place it on my pillow. He had cast himself as the owner of a house he did not own, in writing, addressed to the actual owner, as if the paperwork underneath reality could be replaced with paperwork sitting on top of it. I sat there on that bed in my house, and I read it twice. Then I took a photo of it with my phone. Then I took it to my car and drove to a copy shop and made 5 copies and stored 1 in my glove box and mailed 3 to myself at my apartment via certified mail, so they'd be date-stamped when they arrived. Then I went home and I called my attorney. She was quiet for a moment after I described it. Then she said, he served a fraudulent eviction notice on the deed holder. Yes. She said, I need you to come in tomorrow morning. Bring everything. I brought everything, all of it. The original mortgage documents, the deed, the lease agreement, the purchase agreement, every text message Owen had ever sent me about a payment, 14 months of thumbs-up emojis and apologies and promises. The bank statements showing my payments on the mortgage and his payments to me and the $8,000 gap that had opened between the two, the photos from my walkthrough, and the notice, the original and 4 copies. My attorney looked at it for a long time. Then she said, I want to be very clear with you about what you're looking at here. He can't evict you. There is no legal mechanism by which a tenant in breach of a lease can evict the deed holder. This notice is a legal nullity. But the fact that he served it creates a record of his intent, and combined with the breach of the lease and the arrears, you now have a very strong position to move forward with. She asked me what I wanted. I thought about it. I thought about Owen at the kitchen table, tired, scared, looking sideways. I thought about 14 months of thumbs-up emojis. I thought about 8 months of AA meetings and excellent tomatoes, and a little girl with a painted room. And then I thought about a notice on my pillow, my name, the word tenant. I told her I wanted the house back. Let me tell you what I did not do, because I think it matters as much as what I did. I did not call Owen. I did not call my mother. I did not send a furious text or post anything anywhere or tell a single person in my family what was happening. I did not perform any part of my anger, and I had anger, real anger, the cold, precise kind that doesn't heat up and dissipate. It just clarifies. What I did was work. My attorney filed a formal notice of breach and demand for possession. It was served to Owen at the house by a process server on a Thursday afternoon. It laid out every element of the breach, the arrears amount, the missed payments by date, the clause in the lease that had been violated, the legal basis under Ohio law for reclaiming the property. It gave Owen 30 days to either cure the breach by paying the full arrears in a lump sum or vacate the property. Owen called me within an hour of being served. His voice was a version of his voice I hadn't heard in years. High and fast and off balance, the voice of a person who has just discovered that the ground they were standing on was not actually ground. Carla, what is this? It was not a question. It came out flat like something that had been knocked over. I told him it was exactly what it said it was. He said I was overreacting. He said this was his home. He said Trish's daughter was in school in that district, And if I did this, I would be disrupting a child's entire life over money. I told him I had given him 14 months of goodwill payments and $8,000 of patience, and that what I got in return was a fraudulent eviction notice on my pillow. He was quiet. I said, Owen, you called me a tenant in my own house, in writing, with your signature on it. Longer quiet. Then he said, I didn't think you'd find it right away. I want you to sit with that sentence for a moment the way I had to sit with it. I didn't think you'd find it right away. Not I made a mistake. Not I don't know what I was thinking. Not I'm sorry. He didn't think I'd find it right away. He had a plan for what came after. There was a timeline in his head in which that notice sat on my pillow long enough for something to shift, for reality to take on the shape of the paper sitting on top of it before I got there to read it. I told him the 30-day clock was running. Then I hung up. The phone calls started that evening. Owen first, twice more, both times going to voicemail. Then my mother. Patris called at 8:30. She had the same quality of voice Owen had had, high and urgent, but with an additional layer that Owen's didn't have. Betrayal. As if I were the one who had done something unexpected. Carla, she said, Owen called me. He says you're trying to put them out on the street. I told her I was trying to reclaim my property after a formal breach of a legally binding agreement. She said it's his home. I said it's my house. She said those weren't the same thing, and I said, actually, legally, they are exactly the same thing, and the paperwork agreed with me. She told me that Owen was doing his best, and that Trish's daughter had nothing to do with any of this, and that family didn't serve each other legal papers over money. I told her that family also didn't serve each other fraudulent eviction notices. Silence on her end. I asked her if Owen had mentioned the notice, the one on my pillow. She said she didn't know anything about any notice. I said, ask him, Mom. Ask him what he put on my pillow last week. She said she was sure it was a misunderstanding. I said it wasn't a misunderstanding. It had my name on it, his signature, and a 30-day deadline. Misunderstandings don't have 30-day deadlines. She didn't have anything to say to that. She said she'd call me back. She didn't call back. That night I sat in my apartment and felt the old reflex, the one I'd spent my whole adult life feeding and calling it love. The reflex that said, you're being too hard. The reflex that said, he made a mistake, not a plan. The reflex that said, Trish's daughter has a painted room. I turned the reflex over in my head for a long time. I examined it the way I examine a policy document. I looked at what it was protecting and what it was costing. It was protecting a feeling, the feeling that my generosity was the thing that held my family together. What it was costing was my house. I left the reflex alone. I want to stop here and say something to you directly, because if you've made it this far, you might be living next door to this feeling. I spent 2.5 years telling myself that what I was doing for Owen was love, and some of it was. The AA drives, those were love. The 14 months of on-time payments, the careful documents, the attorney money, those were care and hope dressed up as structure. But covering $8,000 of missed payments without a plan was not love. It was the oldest habit I had. The one that says, if you are useful enough, indispensable enough, the load-bearing wall and the emergency fund, and the person with good credit and the one who knows what subrogation means, then no one can remove you. Then you are safe. A fraudulent eviction notice on your own pillow is what safety that's been purchased with usefulness looks like when the usefulness stops mattering. If you're the one who has been funding something that no one else will name, pull the paperwork tonight. Just the paperwork. Look at your name on it. Look at who else's name is there and who isn't. And then ask yourself what would happen if you let the document mean what it says. Subscribe, because the next part is where the money hit the table, and what came out from under it surprised even me. On day 12 of the 30-day period, Owen called with an offer. He said he'd talked to Trish's parents. They were willing to put up some money, not the full arrears, but half. He could cover the rest over the next 6 months. If I dropped the legal process and extended the lease and modified the purchase agreement to give him an additional 2 years before the buyout option. I wrote down every number while he talked. I asked him to send it to me in writing. He said he would. The written offer came the next day via text, which I had learned by then to document carefully. I forwarded it to my attorney. She said the proposal had structural problems. If I accepted modified terms under duress, and a legal notice of breach constituted duress in the interpretive sense, I was essentially resetting the clock without resolving the underlying breach. I was also extending my exposure. In 2 additional years, Owen could be in the same position or worse, and the arrears could be larger, and the equitable interest argument he'd floated once could theoretically be stronger if his lawyer decided to push it harder next time. She asked what I wanted to do. I thought about it for 2 days. I thought about it the way I think about risk at work, which is not emotionally but architecturally. What were the structures? What did each path expose me to? What was the realistic probability of each outcome? And I thought about the notice on my pillow, and about I didn't think you'd find it right away. I declined the offer. I told Owen through my attorney that the terms of the original demand stood: full arrears within the 30-day window or vacation of the property. He didn't have the full arrears. I knew that when I declined. He hadn't had $8,000 when he was missing payments. He wasn't going to have $8,000 in 2 more weeks. The math didn't change because the deadline did. Day 30 came. Owen did not pay the arrears. My attorney filed with the court for possession. What happened next is the part nobody in my family ever expected, because nobody in my family, except my attorney, knew how carefully I had done the paperwork 2.5 years earlier. The hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks after the filing. Owen retained a lawyer. His lawyer argued the equitable interest theory. He argued that Owen had made substantial improvements to the property and had a reasonable expectation of purchase based on the written agreement. My attorney pointed out that the purchase agreement was not a deed. It was an option. Owen had the right to purchase the property under specific terms, all of which he had violated. There was no basis for equitable interest because the nature of the relationship was unambiguously documented. It was a tenancy. Owen had signed the lease. He had made payments under it. His own payment records, which my attorney entered into evidence, established that he understood himself to be a tenant. And then my attorney submitted the fraudulent eviction notice. The judge looked at it for a long time. Owen's lawyer had not been told about the notice. I could see the moment it landed, the small recalibration in his posture, when he understood that his client had sent a piece of paper claiming ownership of property the deed proved he did not own. The judge asked Owen's attorney if his client disputed the authenticity of the document. Owen's attorney asked for a brief recess. They came back 12 minutes later. Owen's attorney said his client did not dispute the document. The judge awarded possession to me. I'm going to tell you what happened in the car afterward, because I think it's the truest part of the story. My attorney and I walked out of the courthouse into a gray November afternoon, and she said, "Well done." Meaning the documentation. Meaning the 2.5 years of records and the fireproof filing cabinet and the certified mail and the photos with the time-stamped metadata. I sat in my car for a while before I started it. I didn't feel triumphant. I want to be honest about that. Triumph implies that you've won something you wanted to win, and I hadn't wanted any of this. I had wanted Owen to pay the mortgage. I had wanted 14 months of thumbs-up emojis to be the permanent state of things. I had wanted a family Sunday with excellent tomatoes to be what the whole house purchase was pointing toward. What I felt instead was the thing I feel at the end of a long project at work. Flat, steady, done, the file closed, the claim resolved. Not happy exactly, but no longer in motion. Owen had 60 days to vacate under the court order. He called me on day 3. This was a different call from all the others. It wasn't high and fast. It was low and slow, the voice of a man who has run out of versions of the argument and has nothing left but the thing underneath. He said, "I'm sorry about the notice." I didn't say anything. He said it was Trish's idea. "I want you to know that. She said if we established possession on paper, even if it didn't hold up, it might buy us time to get a different lawyer and find another angle. I knew it was wrong. I did it anyway. I'm sorry. I still didn't say anything, because I was deciding whether the sorry was for the notice or for everything that had led to it, and those were different sorries worth different things. He said, I've been sober 4 years, you know that. You were there for the hard part, I know you were there. I said, I know. He said, I don't know how to fix this. I said, you move out, Owen. That's the only thing that fixes this right now. Long pause. He said, and after? I told him after was a different conversation for a different day. I told him I was glad he was still sober. I told him that was real and it mattered, and it wasn't the same as what happened with the house, and I needed him to understand that both of those things could be true at once. He said he understood. I don't know if he did, but he said it. Owen and Trish and her daughter moved out on day 41 of the 60. They moved into a rental 2 miles away. I know this because my mother told me, in a tone carefully calibrated to see how I would respond. I responded by asking if Owen needed help with the move. My mother was quiet for a moment, recalibrating. Then she said, you'd help him after all this. I said, he's my brother, Mom. What happened with the house doesn't change that. She said, you didn't have to take the house back. And I said, I didn't take the house back. The house was always mine. I just stopped pretending otherwise. She didn't have a response to that. The conversation ended shortly after, without resolution, the way a lot of conversations with my mother end. But it ended differently than the earlier ones. It ended with her quiet instead of accusatory, as if something in the accounting had shifted and she was still doing the math. I think she's still doing the math. I want to tell you about the house now, not the legal story of the house, but the thing the house became once Owen and Trish left. I drove over the day after they vacated. I had a key. I'd always had a key, but it felt different using it this time. The house was empty in the particular way that houses are empty after people who really lived there have left. The sage green front door. The kitchen table where Owen and I had sat and he'd looked sideways at the floor. The backyard with the remnants of the tomato plants, dead now, November having gotten to them, but still recognizable in the cages Owen had built around them. I walked through every room. The bedroom the little girl had stayed in had small stickers on the closet door, the kind children put on things to mark them as theirs. Flowers, mostly. Little ones. They'd been careful about it, placed at a 6-year-old's height, well below the line where they'd interfere with anything. I stood in that room for a while. I am not a sentimental person. You know that about me by now. But I am a person, and the stickers were very small and very specific, and I stood in that room longer than I had planned to. Then I walked out and started making a list. Here is what the house needed: new paint in 2 of the 3 bedrooms, a plumber to look at the 2nd bathroom. The fence Owen had built was solid but needed treating. The kitchen appliances were aging but functional. The roof had been inspected when I purchased and had years left. Here is what the house had: good bones, a good street, a better neighborhood than it had been 2 years ago, 3 bedrooms, a yard with a season of tomato cages in it that I was, for reasons I did not examine closely, leaving where they were for the time being. I hired a property manager. I put the house on the rental market at a rate that reflected the current neighborhood, which had increased significantly since I bought it. The house was rented within 3 weeks to a couple, both teachers, who asked if the yard was usable for a garden. I told them it had a history with tomatoes. The rent covered the mortgage and then some. My savings account, the one I'd been drawing down for $8,000 of Owen's missed payments, started going the other direction. The house was always going to do this. If the plan had gone the way the lease said it was supposed to go, it would have done it quietly, in Owen's name, with my name as the invisible structure underneath. Instead, it did it loudly, with a court order attached, with my name exactly where it had always been, on the deed. Numbers don't change depending on whose name you put on the notice. They just sit there being true. It's been 14 months since the court date. Owen is still sober. I know because Deb tells me, and because he called me on my birthday in October and we talked for 20 minutes about nothing in particular. The careful nothing in particular of two people who have been through something and are working out how to be around each other afterward. It wasn't warm, not the way the Thanksgiving with the excellent tomatoes was warm, but it was honest. And honest is what I have learned to value over warm, because warm can be performed and honest can't. My mother and I have a functional relationship. I say functional because that's the accurate word. She calls on Sundays. We talk about the news, about Deb's kids in Phoenix, about Glenn's health, which has been stable. She doesn't mention the house. I don't mention the house. The house is the agreed-upon silence between us, and I'm all right with that. I spent a lot of years maintaining silences that cost me more than they cost anyone else. This one is different. This one is equal. Owen and Trish are still together. I don't know the full picture of their finances, and I'm not trying to find out. What I know is that a few months after they moved out, Owen did something I hadn't expected. He mailed me a check for $1,200. There was no note, no explanation, no promise of more, just a check for $1,200 in an envelope with his return address and nothing else inside. I held that check for a long time. Then I deposited it, and I sent him a text that said, "Received, thank you," and I meant both parts equally. He replied with a thumbs-up emoji, and for once, that was exactly the right response. There's something I've been thinking about since all of this ended, something I want to leave you with because I think it might be the most useful thing in this whole story. I work in risk assessment. My job is to look at a situation, identify the exposure, and price it correctly. Not optimistically, not pessimistically, correctly. And what I have come to understand, from 12 years of doing that professionally and 2.5 years of failing to do it personally, is this. The thing that makes us bad at assessing our own risk is not stupidity. It's not even trust, exactly. It's the story we've decided to believe, and how much we've already invested in that story. I had invested enormously in the story that Owen's sobriety meant he had become the version of himself I had been driving to meetings to help create. And that story was not wrong, exactly. He is sober. That is real. But sobriety is not the same as reliability, and reliability is not the same as honesty, and honesty is not the same as not putting a fraudulent eviction notice on your sister's pillow when you're scared and someone tells you it might buy time. People contain more than one true thing about them simultaneously. That is the hardest accounting I have ever had to do. I bought the house because I loved my brother. I reclaimed it because the document said it was mine. Both of those things came from the same place in me. The same person who keeps records and drives people to meetings and makes certified copies and checks on tomato plants in November. The paperwork was not the opposite of love. The paperwork was what love looks like, when it has been doing the math long enough to know the difference between a risk worth taking and a building with no foundation. I just wish I'd been brave enough to stop carrying things that weren't mine to carry a long time before a notice on a pillow made the decision for me. That's my story. A house, a notice, and 14 months of figuring out what family costs when you're the one keeping the receipts. If this hit something close to home for you, if you're the one with the good credit and the signed documents and the person who knows where the file is, drop a comment. Tell me what you're carrying that nobody else has put their name on. Hit subscribe, share this with the person who needs it, and I'll see you in the next one.